Welcome to Connected Intelligence, a podcast about all the things we bring to work that aren't actually about the work. Join us in conversation about the building blocks that bring complex ideas to life, not the code, calculations, or research, but the bonds between teammates, the connection to your purpose, and the character that you build along the way. Welcome back, listeners. I'm your host, Sonia Senek. Today's guest is Iliana Oris Valiente. Iliana is an accomplished corporate executive, innovation and emerging tech pioneer, startup investor, respected board member, published author, and sought-after global public speaker. With a clear vision and unwavering determination, she's a thought leader on a mission to build a future humans want to live in. Iliana is currently the managing director and innovation lead at Accenture Canada. Iliana has been featured in various media outlets, including television, radio, and print. Additionally, she's an active board member at Sunnybrook Hospital, CPA Ontario, and DIACC, and mentor startups through global programs such as the Creative Destruction Lab. We talked to Iliana about her digital twin, the future of work, and what it's like to be a sequoia tree or an air plant. Please enjoy Iliana Oris Valiente. Iliana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start at the very beginning. So you do an amazing job of translating new technologies for the people around you. What folks may not know is that translating across many languages is actually a part of your life. You speak English, Russian, Spanish, and French. Can you share a bit about your journey as a global citizen?
Absolutely. So most people don't know this, but I'm actually half Russian, half Cuban. And so I spent my childhood years bouncing between two very unlikely places in the world, Siberia and Cuba. And so that early cultural exposure had me learning to adjust to different cultures, different people, different languages, different weather patterns, and everything in between. And while it wasn't easy at the time, I'm really grateful for that experience because those formative years made me the person that I am today. And my friends joke that whether you move me to a different country or ship me to a different planet, give me a couple of days or weeks and I will be totally integrated. And in fact, I'll probably be running for some sort of a local office and be just one of the crew.
The mayor of Mars. And what was the biggest challenge that you had, or some of the challenges you faced as you were going through so many different cultural spaces? And what did it teach you?
Well, definitely being the outsider and being the newbie taught me to listen and actually pay attention and hear, because I didn't have the luxury of doing otherwise. And how could you integrate and connect with people if you're not taking that time? You know, the expression, you have 2 ears and only one mouth. And so I spent a lot of my early childhood years being very quiet and introverted. I read a ton because it's something that didn't require other people, and it's something that I could do on my own time, in my own pace. So that's something that I really appreciated and still maintain to today. So while I'm very sociable and I love people, oftentimes people misread me as an extrovert, I am by definition an introvert. I recharge at home by myself with the curtains closed. You can picture me as an appliance plugged into a wall. And I need to recharge my batteries. That's me.
Over the last few years specifically, you and I have chatted a lot about your vision for the future of work. And in a post-pandemic workforce, in the spaces that we're in now, what are some of the trends you're noticing that excite you the most?
Mm-hmm. The trends that I'm excited about in the future of work really boil down to this one word of flexibility. And the other word would be fit for purpose and fit for humans. So when I talk about flexibility, it's not just about this question of where do we work from? It's not the return to office debate, because it's much broader than that. It's also flexibility around the time of work. I remember during the pandemic, one of my teammates had approached me, and due to childcare challenges with his partner also needing to work and having far less flexibility, they asked sheepishly if I would be okay if they started their workday earlier. I was like, okay, well, what time are you thinking? Like 6 a.m. I'm a morning person. And my response was, I don't actually care what time you start work. you are an exceptionally smart, competent human. We've hired you for a reason. I know you're an early bird and you're highly productive, so you can start work really whenever you want to, so long as there's enough overlap between the teams that you lead and your results are not affected. And so he started his days at 5 o'clock in the morning. And has his productivity suffered? Absolutely not. And I've joked that whether he works from 12 a.m. to 5 a.m., it's all the same to me, because we're moving towards outcome-based work as opposed to the punch-in, punch-out mentality, which does not work today in 2023, 2024, and beyond. And the last bit around this idea of flexible work is that people have different strengths. They have different weaknesses. What's one person's joy is another person's chore. So encouraging business leaders to build roles around their people as opposed to trying to force fit them into boxes is powerful, because you're going to get the most out of your people when they feel like the work that they're doing is aligned to their core strengths. I would not ask someone who is in a head of operations role today to play a role that's completely outside of their strength domain. I'm a huge fan of personality assessments. My teams have done all sorts.
You have all the acronyms?
I have all of the acronyms, but the more people understand themselves, the better they are going to be in advocating for themselves at work, and the better business leaders will be in placing them into roles. So that's everything on the flexible side of the agenda. The second piece around work that's fit for humans is important as we shift into this AI-powered era. And of course, people are worried about jobs and what does this mean for society. And in a lot of cases, this is actually a jobs augmentation story. And we're starting to see shifts within the workforce around the use of AI agents. And we could talk more about Lila and how I'm bringing this concept to life.
So I think, just so everyone knows who Lila is, if you could introduce her, please.
So Lila is my AI-powered digital human twin. You can take a moment to let that sink in. She looks like me. She sounds like me. She's been trained on upwards of 6 hours of my voice in podcast studios, where I've read everything from children's stories to obituaries, so she could learn my sad voice, to reading Larry Fink's annual letter to stakeholders, which takes about 45 minutes top to tail, and it's perfect business level material. And we've also been training her on the last 5 years worth of case studies of every single project that my teams have run in the last few years. So talk about an extension of me that augments me and gives me superpowers. Maybe I could borrow the Red Bull expression of Red Bull gives you wings, AI gives you wings. So this idea of AI agents is emerging, and they are going to be our co-pilots. There's actually interesting research from Accenture that suggests that by 2026, 3/4 of all knowledge workers are going to have some sort of a co-pilot that they interact with on a daily basis. So if you have these AI agents that are coming into the workforce, and if you have AI tools that are automating and augmenting what we're spending our time on, there's really this reimagination of what is the work to be done, and how do we best structure that work so that it can be done well by humans, and the work that doesn't make sense to be done by humans gets done by the technology.
You're using the term knowledge workers. Can you share who you would put into that bucket right now?
So let me tell you about a trend that we're paying very close attention to right now. And it's the fact that technology is becoming a lot more human by design. What does it mean to be human? It's the way we think. It's the way we speak. It's the way we hear. It's the way we process information. It's the way that we retain information. It's the way we act. And now technology is starting to mimic a lot of those very core, basic humans. And so when I refer to this idea of knowledge work, I'm really referring to work that is not reliant on physical manual labor, but rather is reliant on the thinking, reading, comprehension, writing, analysis, all the sorts of tasks that AI is really well suited for. In fact, There's a really great research report that maybe we can link for audience members from the World Economic Forum that lists occupations based on the level of exposure to LLM tasks. So it broke down over 18,000 different job descriptions based on massive global databases, and then analyzed within a job role, how many of those tasks could AI actually augment or automate. And so it's a fascinating analysis that breaks it down industry by industry, role by role, function by function. And what I would encourage people to do as they future-proof themselves and their careers is to read those reports and to ask the question critically of yourself of, does this reflect my current reality? And if so, how can you start to use these AI tools to augment you today so that you're not left behind in the dust?
So maybe listeners are thinking, at what point does Lila become more competent, more intelligent, able to deliver Iliana-related knowledge faster or at a higher, more advanced level than Iliana herself? What is that tipping point? Is there a tipping point?
I look forward to the day that Lila can do certain tasks better than I can at scale, because that's going to give me the ability to be in more than one place at the same time. Can you think of a time that you finished everything that's on your to-do list? Like in the last week, was there ever a Tuesday where you said, that's it, I'm done everything?
Fair question. I cannot think of a time.
Neither can I. And the reality is that there are aspects of every single one of our jobs that don't actually make sense for us, the human to do time and time again. I'll give you an example. Every week, somebody approaches me to say, hi, Iliana, we're working on a project with a client in industry XYZ, say retail. Have we ever done anything or encountered a challenge that's similar to this in any of the other industries that your innovation teams have done? And so what do? I go through my mental Rolodex of every single project that we've done, and I pull out comparables, case studies, people that they should talk to, research reports that they should read. And this conversation takes place at least 3 times a week, minimum, usually more frequently. Swap out the industries because my roles are so large and I oversee a number of different files. But what if I'm out sick that day? What if I've lost my voice? What if I'm traveling on holidays and I'm just not available, or my calendar is jam-packed for the next 2 weeks and I cannot accommodate this phone call? Wouldn't it be better for everyone involved if you could just talk to Lila and have her point you to those first case studies so you could go have those early scoping discussions, and by the time they're ready to have a meeting with Mimi, the real human, we can dig right in and have a really meaningful conversation? That's a much better use of my time and their time than the alternative.
So let's talk a little bit about your role at Accenture, because you mentioned in passing that you oversee many files. Can you share a bit more about what those files are and also the size of your team and where your team works?
Absolutely. So right now, my role is as the Managing Director and Head of Innovation and ESG for Canada. So that means I oversee quite the range. It's everything from our industry innovation teams in retail, in insurance, in natural resources, and the list goes on, to our ventures team, which focuses on startups that Accenture has invested in, and we're then taking to market and introducing them to some of our corporate clients, helping to reduce that sales cycle. Anyone who's ever worked in a startup knows how hard it can be to tee up a partnership with these corporate organizations. And so that's one of the areas where we're able to accelerate. I oversee the work that we do on the sustainability side of things. We have an amazing team that specializes in design thinking as a discipline, and bringing that into the ways of working of the more traditional strategy and consulting type of practitioners has been fascinating. I oversee teams of people who wake up every morning and they just think about 1 or 2 clients that they oversee and how they can service them more effectively.
So at Accenture, in addition to the strategic thinking you're doing, the technology thinking you're doing, you're also managing a large number of people. And how does coaching and mentorship play into your leadership style? And what advice would you give to listeners who are maybe managing people for the first time on how to be a great leader?
I would say that one of my favorite parts of the role is getting to lead people. And that is a skill set on its own that oftentimes we don't teach people and they become accidental managers. And I think that that is to the detriment of the people placed in those management roles and to the detriment of the people that they oversee. So the highlights of my week are when I get to take my team members out for a long coffee chat or a lunch, and we can really dig into who they are as a person, what do they care about, what are their career ambitions, what are their dreams, aspirations, or concerns, and how do we help get them from point A to point B, and making room for their personal life as part of the discussion in addition to their professional life. And so my advice for anyone who's in a people leadership role is to remember that the folks that you're working with are just humans. They're not robots. And it's just that I frankly don't see this happening often enough. And in this era of AI-powered everything, what we really need to lean into are what it means to be human and recognizing that.
You started coming up with a theory around different personality types. You call it the potted plant theory. Can you share a bit more about that?
So the potted plant theory is premised on this idea that people have different personality preferences based on one of two different sets of dimensions. The first dimension is an individual's need for novelty versus their need for certainty and stability. There's a trade-off in that. And the second dimension is the amount of resources that an individual needs in their life in order for them to feel established, secure, and to really thrive. For some people, that's a low amount of resources. And for others, they have a much higher resource requirement. And so depending on where you fall on that 2x2 matrix, you may fall into one of four archetypes, ranging from sequoia trees on one side, all the way through to air plants on the other extreme. So as a sequoia tree, as you can imagine, they're giant. They're these majestic trees. They've been around for hundreds of years. They have extensive root systems, and you can't move them, even if you wanted to, even if your life depended on it. That was your one task. You can't. They physically defy transplantation. And they also need a lot of resources: space, water, soil, fertilizer, sunshine. So a sequoia personifies this idea of an individual who has a high need for resources and a high need for certainty and stability. If you contrast that most sharply with an air plant, for listeners, Google the term air plant. You've seen them. You've walked into a shop before and they're hanging from the ceiling in a little string in a glass jar, and they don't have traditional roots. If you give them too much water or soil or fertilizer, they will die. They thrive in an environment of lower resources because that's what they need. And the human equivalents of air plants tend to correlate with a much higher need for novelty and for adventure. If you ask them to stay put in one geographical place, in one type of occupation, any construct that is limiting, that's not the location in which they are going to thrive. So much like plants in the real world, you walk into a shop, you don't judge a plant based on its care and maintenance instructions. They are what they are. In the forest, everyone coexists. I feel strongly that humans are much in the same way, and these are simply two extra dimensions that we could use to get to know ourselves better and to understand others better.
Have you ever met a sequoia tree who thought they were an air plant?
No.
Have you ever met an air plant that thought they were a sequoia tree?
Yes.
And how did that turn out?
So there was actually one particular story that will stay with me forever. I was at a dinner party in New York City, and I didn't know anyone except for the host. And I came to this dinner party, I got to chatting to this woman who, on the surface, had her whole life beautifully designed, planned out, etc. And at one point, this theory came up. I was in the early days of thinking about it. And she asked a lot of follow-up questions. She was quite engaged, but I didn't think much of it. We went our separate ways at dinner. And at the very end of the night, she comes up to me and she grabs me by my elbows. And so you can imagine how physically close she is to me. And she looks me in the eyes and says, "I just wanted to thank you." Meanwhile, my instinct is to look behind me. Is she talking to somebody else? No, she's talking to me. Like, oh, what for? She goes on. Our conversation is the most insightful conversation I've had so far this year. And thank you for helping me recognize that I think I'm actually a potted plant, but I've been living as a sequoia tree my entire life. I need to go home now and drastically reevaluate every aspect of my life to figure out how I can live more in alignment to who I truly am. That story gives me goosebumps.
And not just because she was grabbing your elbows.
And not just because she was grabbing my elbows, but because this resonated so deeply with her, and it got her to question assumptions about the life she was leading and the life she thought she should be leading. Because right now we're living in a world that is mostly designed for the sequoias, by sequoias, because that's been the predominant lifestyle. And helping people realize that there are other paths is really important for me.
So speaking of assumptions, if you could think back to the beginning of your career, when you were thinking through what your next decisions would be, what your first job should be, who and what you wanted to become in the professional spaces, what were some assumptions you had then that have stayed true? And what are some assumptions you made then that were incorrect?
Growing up, immigrant family, everyone assumed that I was going to be an engineer. I assumed I was going to be an engineer. It was not asked. It was not a point of debate ever. And if I wasn't going to be an engineer, maybe I would go into medicine. Those are really your only two options. And there was never a question as to whether I was going to go on to a university or college type program. It was just implicit assumption. And funny enough, I once went to Take Your Kids to Work Day and followed a family friend who was a respiratory therapist. And I ran around the hospital with her, and it was a fascinating day. And at the end of the day, she turns to me and says, "Iliana, you should never be a medical practitioner." What? I'm confused. Why not? She said, "You asked a lot of fascinating questions today, and they were all great questions. How do you prioritize one case over another case? And what if there are two code blues that happen simultaneously? And how do you get from one side of the hospital to the other? And how many other people have your role? And how do you train?" And her comment was, "You would be a great hospital administrator one day as opposed to a day-to-day practitioner." Oh, fascinating, because it had never occurred to me that that was going to be a viable pathway. Now, fast forward a couple of decades, and guess what? I happen to sit on the board of directors of a major hospital, Sunnybrook Hospital here in Toronto, one of the top 25 hospitals globally. And so her prediction that I was going to be an effective administrator actually turned out to be very, very, very accurate. And so the reason I tell the story is that sometimes other people around you are a really good judge of character and your strengths. And we should listen and collect some of that input as we go and build a career path that really makes sense for who we are. So I love that particular story.
Love that. And how do you balance advice from listening to your inner voice of what you know is right for you? Because I think advice and mentorship is so important. Leaning on the stories of folks that have tried things or done things that we're ambitious to do is so valuable. How do you balance those two things?
I'll tell you a story about a very senior partner that I worked with in the past, who at one point approached me and we were having a career conversation, and he says, "Have you read this book, Designing Your Life?" I hadn't. And he urged me to go and read the book. And so I went off and I did all of the activities that are in the book, and I did all of the mind maps. And not long thereafter, I went back to this partner and said, I'm so sorry, but I think I need to resign. And he smiled at me knowingly and said, yes, I know that's the case. And I was flabbergasted. I was like, what do you mean? In his role, he couldn't flat out tell me, Iliana, I think you're ready for your next adventure. You've outgrown this pot. You're ready for your next bigger and better thing. Because he's like, I'm a partner of this organization. I have a fiduciary responsibility to keep you here as long as humanly possible. But that's a good example of I took the time to understand myself, to reflect, to do the journals over the course of a couple of months, to interview people close to me, people in other domains, get really crisp on what are the sorts of things I wanted to do. So that was the internal assessment, coupled with the external advice and input and nudge that I got. And it's at the combination of those two things that magic happened for me. And funny enough, I was going through and doing spring cleaning, and I found one of the big pieces of architect paper that I had used back in the day to map out my future life. And eerily, my life at that time looked shockingly like what I had doodled on that piece of paper long before my current role even existed. The title didn't exist. The concepts for the role I had at the time didn't exist. It's powerful.
Did your map include an AI agent?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm not that clairvoyant.
You never know.
You never know.
So you mentioned that you're on the board of Sunnybrook Hospital, which is an amazing institution, as you mentioned. For folks that are listening, can you share about the importance of a board, the role of a board, and then how do you approach your roles on boards?
Mm-hmm. The role of the board is very important, and they are the ultimate stewards of the organization. They are responsible and accountable for the strategic direction of the organization and making sure that it gets there. It's the role of the management team to do the delivery of the strategy and the implementation of it all. But who does the CEO ultimately report into? The board is what keeps the CEO accountable. And it's the role of the board to ask really tough questions, not about the day-to-day operations of the business. It's not about working in the business. It's about working on the business. Mm-hmm. There is a famous quote that's used in board circles around the role of the board member is to have their noses in and their fingers out. The doing is the responsibility of the management team, but the board needs to be looking at what's happening in the ecosystem outside. Where is the world going? Where are the winds blowing? And how do they continue to pivot the ship to manage the risks and to harness into the opportunity spaces? So board work is important. It's a great way to make an outsized impact on an organization without necessarily being in the details for 50 or 60 hours per week. And it's a powerful accountability function. It's an area where we need to have more diversity on boards because the world is changing so quickly. You want to have all of those perspectives shared and incorporated into the planning.
And so for you, who at Accenture, you're running teams, you're very much in the operations, you're hands-on with the work that you're doing, to switch gears from that on a day-to-day basis to sit in a board meeting or get a board update and engage with the leadership team or management team from Sunnybrook, how do you switch gears and balance that dynamic?
I actually find that my Accenture role equips me perfectly for board work because a lot of my time I'm actually invited in to speak to boards of directors and in to present to client executives across industries on the topic of trends. What are the societal trends? What are the technology trends that we should be paying attention to? And so when I come into a boardroom, whether it's at Sunnybrook or CPA Ontario or the Digital Identity Council of Canada, it's the same mindset that I am bringing because I'm actually already operating at that 30,000 foot view. I've seen what the 3 insurance companies in North America that we've been talking to recently are thinking about and what the retailers are thinking about. And you can start to see the commonalities.
So speaking of being aware of trends, we read a story in the Globe and Mail about you sitting in a hairdresser's chair and putting on a VR headset, only to bump into an Accenture colleague from Germany in the same metaverse. Is this true? And
Yes.
what was that experience like?
So the backstory is I had been traveling, and I usually have my VR headset. At the time, I had it in my carry-on. And naturally, as one does. It's always funny when I clear security and the security guards always pull out. They're like, ma'am, what is this? Oh, it's my VR headset. So I was getting my hair done, and my hair stylist, we got on the topic of virtual reality, and it turned out he had never experienced being in one of these environments. So I said, well, I actually happen to have my headset on me. Would you like to try? I'm like, oh, of course. Why not? And so I log him into Altspace, which is one of our virtual environments that we were using, and took him to the nth floor, which is the Accenture replica of an office space. And so he's walking around, and it's fascinating. And at one point, he looks startled, and he takes off the headset. And so when I asked, what's going on? He says, there's a voice. There's a person. They're talking to me. I don't know what to do. So I take the headset, I put it on, and sure enough, it's one of my colleagues from our office in Germany. And meanwhile, we're in one of our US, I think it was a San Francisco replica of our office. And so I proceeded to have a conversation with this German colleague, and it turned out we were working on some similar things, and we agreed to exchange contact info, and he was going to send me some materials. So I take off the headset, and my hairstylist's comment was, "Did you just network in the metaverse?" Like, yep, okay, apparently I did.
What role do you think the metaverse is going to play in our personal and professional lives?
There's this blurred line between the physical world, the virtual world, and everything in between. And this is one of the big forces that is going to redefine the future of work and redefine the future of, how we as consumers live and work. As an example, imagine folks working in the car industry and car designers who are getting together to review the latest models and doing quality assurance type checks. There have now been instances where they're able to shorten a design review process from being over a week long and flying people in from all over the world to it taking a day, with folks being able to do it in immersive virtual reality environments. And the participants have said, we like this new hybrid approach even better than the original way. We don't want to go back to the way things were being done.
Why do you think they like it better?
Because they were able to accomplish things as effectively in a shorter period of time and without having to get on an airplane for something that they could do from the comfort of their home or from their local office.
You lead multidisciplinary teams, experts in so many different areas, technology areas, implementation. How do you stitch together a group of people that are amazing in their space, but the connectivity in the whole is greater than the sum of its parts kind of theme? How do you make sure you're leading teams and pulling them together in a way where they can be most effective?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's a formula to it, but folks are either really good at connecting the dots or they're exceptional subject matter domain experts. In my professional experience, they usually fall into one of those two camps. And so it's important to ensure that any of the teams that we're staffing have that combinatorial effect. Otherwise, you could have 5 practitioners that are going off and doing things in their own bubbles, but you need those connectors to be able to stitch things together and to translate and to keep the client and to keep the end goal at the center of everything that they're doing. This is also why it's so powerful to have teams that are rooted in design as a skill set, because one of the core principles of design is human centricity. And so the human in question could be the end user of a product. It could be an employee of an organization. It could be the leadership team member of a client organization. And so having people on the team who always keep that human in the focus is important.
And how do you tackle problems that you've never solved before?
Sometimes you look at proxies and what you can learn from adjacent industries, or sometimes industries that are completely unrelated. And other times you find a hypothesis and you test it, much like a scientist would. And people often think of a prototype as just a technology prototype, but a prototype could be a piece of paper with a mock-up that you're taking around to stakeholders to see if this is going to meet their needs.
When you're thinking ahead, so you took us back to the moment where, a mentor of yours gave you a book and it inspired you to go and try to architect your life and your next stages in your career. Where do you see yourself 10 years from now?
That's a good question. So I love people. I love understanding them. I think that's a big motivation behind me building the potted plant theory. And so finding ways that I can continue to help people unlock their own lives and help them be architects of their own life. I really am not kidding when I say that I recommend that book all of the time. And I'm not affiliated with them. If the authors happen to hear this podcast, please reach out to me. I would love to befriend you because you guys are super inspiring. So that piece of it is super important. I love the fact that I've gotten to play in roles where I'm operating at a 30,000 foot view across industries and various functional areas, and the ability to connect the dots. So I think that's hugely important. It's part of the reason why I spend so much time at the Creative Destruction Lab and mentoring startups and investing in startups in my personal capacity, because I believe strongly that the next wave of innovation really will come from entrepreneurs. And so the ability of seeing them succeed is powerful. So that's why I'm a venture investor and love the work that happens inside of those frontiers. And I love writing, thinking, connecting the things that I've heard from people, public speaking, sharing those ideas. So long as I'm able to stitch together all of those different aspects while living a life that makes sense for me, being a global citizen, having my handful of home bases around the world that I'm splitting time between, I'm a happy camper.
Sorry, I was just going to make a camping joke, but I won't, because I'm more of a glamper than a camper, to be honest. So I want to talk a little bit about you as a mentor. So you mentioned that you are a mentor at the Creative Destruction Lab. What is the most common piece of advice that you provide to venture founders and entrepreneurs?
A lot of the advice boils down to storytelling. And you'd be surprised by the number of ventures that haven't quite figured out who it is that they're servicing. Who is your customer? Who cares about the product and the thing that you are building? Why did that person get out of bed that morning? And how do you make sure that your product actually solves that particular pain point and you explain it in a way that makes sense for them? A lot of startups in the early days, if I'm investing or if they're approaching me for coaching, we're spending the first 2 or 3 hours trying to unearth what is it that they actually do that's the real, true secret sauce that hasn't been done before, but that needs to exist in the world. And once you've excavated, because it really does feel like an excavation, that nugget, everything else becomes clearer. What they focus on, who they hire, who they partner with, who they sell to, all of that. And I think that that's an underrated skill set. The other thing I would say is often about the relationship between the entrepreneur and the VC that funds them. Because a lot of times, I don't think entrepreneurs stop to realize that they're entering a 10-year business relationship with these firms, and there needs to be a value add. And I think it's part of the reason why I'm so bullish on more niche VC funds that are run by folks who have experience in the domains that now they're investing in. They have that experience to bring to the table.
And because they have that experience, what else can they offer those venture founders that had they not had that experience, they would not be able to provide?
So a VC that has experience actually building a business, scaling a business, exiting a business, and that has a depth of niche industry expertise, has the network to be able to introduce a startup to the next partner that's going to scale them, to potential customers, to potential talent, to other investors that would be strategic, in addition to knowing where the pitfalls might be as they're running a business, because they have the battle scars to go with it. So I'm very bullish on this idea of prior founder-led VC firms.
So for the listeners that are at the early stages of their career, they're starting to advance, they're starting to maybe have a small team that they're leading, what advice would you give them about how to map their career journey and what should guide them for their next steps?
I would start with taking that strengths inventory of who are you as a person, what gets you going, and collect feedback from people that you've worked with to understand where some of your gaps are, because you are not perfect. I joke sometimes with some of our more junior talent that I could never get hired into their roles today because I just don't have that same level of depth in some of the areas that they do day in, day out, day in, day out. And that's okay. Mm-hmm. As a manager, knowing where your specialty is and where you're relying on other people to complement and augment you is super powerful. And it's not about pride. In fact, the more you acknowledge your shortcomings and where your teams can be helpful, the sooner you're all going to be able to thrive together.
Nicely said. And last question. 10 years from now, where do you feel AI will be in our professional and personal lives?
It will be pervasive, and it will also be behind the scenes. What I mean by that is a lot of the applications that we're using today are starting to integrate Gen AI capabilities, and AI capabilities are transforming the back offices of every large organization that you've ever had a chance to interact with. So it will be everywhere, but it's not necessarily always going to be front of mind, and we will adjust to it in the same way that we're used to talking to our Alexas and Siris. There's an entire generation that's going to grow up with virtual assistants and a future where you have agents of these, you'll have networks of AI agents that work with each other, independent of their human counterparts. And you will have the humans that play a role in training these AI agents, supervising them. And we'll see the creation of new roles that we couldn't even contemplate from where we sit today. But it's a lot easier to build the future when you are actively innovating, as opposed to burying our head in the sand and saying, la, 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 this isn't happening. It's easier to just roll up your sleeves and start, and you'll learn a lot in the process. Obviously, be responsible. Responsible AI is super important. There are principles around this to be followed, but start experimenting, because you're not going to be able to theorize your way out of this while sitting on your couch.